We continued on learning about the three questions that were asked, basically on the opinion that a sukkah that has non-kosher schach in the middle of the sukkah. We asked the question: how could you hold that the maximum amount of non-kosher schach in the sukkah is up to 4 amas, four handbreadths, 4 tefachim, 4 handbreadths. The other opinion is 4 amas, 4 cubits. So there was 2 opinions, and we kept asking on the opinion that's 4 handbreadths that there seems to be proofs that you should have more space of non-kosher schach, and the sukkah should still be kosher. And so what were the 3 questions? Well, one question was a Mishnah that we had earlier that said if a person placed on the sukkah a board is 4 handbreadths, that's 4 handbreadths, and the Mishnah said it's kshera. It said it's kosher, and the Gemara understands that would probably mean that in the middle of your sukkah you have a 4 handbreadth board, and the board is what we're considering non-kosher schach. How could it say that it's kosher? We have an opinion here that says that 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach is invalid. It invalidates the sukkah. So the Gemara answered on that question that what we're talking about is that's in the side of the sukkah. It would be in the middle of the sukkah, it would not be kosher. But it's in the side of the sukkah, therefore it is kosher because we have the law of doifen akum. So that's the first question and the first answer. Basically, this question was on Shmuel. Shmuel is of the opinion that non-kosher schach in the middle of the sukkah invalidates the sukkah, even if it's just 4 handbreadths. And the answer was that this case of the Mishnah is not talking about that it's in the middle of the sukkah, it's on the side. On the side of the sukkah, everyone agrees that you have up to 4 cubits. So I should just clarify one thing, and that is that we're dealing with 2 similar issues, but they're not the same. Number one is a board that's 4 handbreadths. That board, according to a board that's 4 handbreadths, of course, there was a discussion about it before, but that, according to Shmuel, everyone holds would be non-kosher schach. 4 handbreadth board, non-kosher schach. And even if it's just 3 handbreadths, it also might be non-kosher schach. That would be one opinion, according to the way Shmuel learned earlier, that even if it's just 3 handbreadths of a board, that also could be non-kosher schach. But that doesn't
I'd like to speak with somebody about the free holiday.
That doesn't mean that it invalidates the sukkah. So that's the one point is if a board is non-kosher schach, if it's 4 handbreadths, if it's 3 handbreadths, and we had a whole discussion, might be non-kosher schach. According to many opinions, the 4 handbreadths for sure, according to almost all the opinions, was non-kosher schach. 3 handbreadths, at least according to one opinion, is non-kosher schach. But that doesn't mean it invalidates the sukkah. It's non-kosher schach. Now comes the next issue, and that is how much is needed to invalidate a sukkah. So, it's a little confusing because when you start thinking about this board that's non-kosher schach, it doesn't mean that it's invalidating the sukkah. It just means that board is a board that's considered non-kosher schach. So keep that in mind. So anyway, so the bottom line is we just explained the first question and answer, and now we're up to the second question the Gemara has. And this question is really a question on Rav's original opinion that Rav held that non-kosher schach in the middle of the sukkah invalidates it at 4 handbreadths. Again, there's another version that says Rav holds you have up to 4 cubits. That's the Neherdah version, but the Surah version is that it invalidates it with 4 handbreadths. So that version, on that, the Gemara has a question on Rav. The reason why the Gemara is specifically asking the question on Rav, if you look in the Gemara, it's very interesting how the wording of this Gemara. If you look at all 3 questions, the first question, it says it's good according to Rav, but what is Shmuel going to do? So the first question of the Gemara was specifically asking on Shmuel. In the second version, which means the Neherdah version, where we have Rav and Shmuel, the Gemara was asking on Shmuel. And it's not, interestingly enough, it doesn't spell out that it's asking on Rav in the first version, which holds the same thing as Shmuel, but it only is asking on Shmuel. The second question of the Gemara, if you look in the wording, it says, Bishleim alahach lishna of Rav. It goes good according to this version of Rav, but what about the earlier version, the Surah version of Rav? How is Rav going to answer it? Now, why is this Gemara not asking on Shmuel? So in other words, the previous Gemara didn't ask on the first version of Rav. This Gemara is only asking on the first version of Rav, but not on Shmuel, even though they hold the same thing. Seemingly, you could ask the question on both, but the Gemara doesn't say Bishleima l'Rav and what's Shmuel going to do. It doesn't say that. Or Bishleima, it says Bishleima l'hach lishna d'amarav. So what's the meaning? Why in the second question is it not asking on Shmuel? It's only asking on the first version of Rav. And the answer is because this brisa that we're going to be asking a question is based on another debate of Rav and Shmuel. And being that you need to connect the other Rav, it's only a question on Rav because Shmuel has another view in when it comes to boards and so on. So the question over here is only going to affect Rav. It's not going to affect Shmuel because he learns a different in the other laws. He learns it differently, and you'll see why. You'll see what I mean. What do I mean? Well, the brisa here is that 2 sheets are mitzdaref, 2 boards are not mitzdaref. They don't join together. Mitzdaref means join together. So 2 sheets will join together. The sheets are not kosher for schach. The boards, the first opinion is they don't join together. Reb Meir says nesarim kesadinim, that they do join together. So what does this mean that they join together and they invalidate the sukkah? So the Gemara understands that. The Gemara understands. One second here. That if we follow the first version of Rav, that you don't have 4 handbreadths. 4 handbreadths will invalidate your sukkah in the middle. So how do you understand? How are you going to understand this brisa that says that according to Reb Meir, the boards are going to join together just like sheets? What does this mean? Reb Meir holds that boards are non-kosher for schach. Reb Yehuda held they are kosher for schach. So the first part of the brisa was that you have sheets, they'll join together, they'll invalidate your sukkah. The boards won't invalidate your sukkah. Why won't the boards invalidate your sukkah? Reb Yehuda holds the boards are no problem. You're allowed to use boards for schach. That's the way Rav learned that discussion earlier. Now, what about Reb Meir's view? So Rav understands Reb Meir that he holds that boards are invalid for schach. They're not kosher for schach. And the brisa says that according to Reb Meir, they will actually join together to invalidate your sukkah. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? What type of boards are we talking about? So Rav is the one who says that the boards are talking about that they're 4 handbreadth boards. Shmuel holds that these boards might be talking about 3 handbreadth boards from the previous Gemara. So the Gemara here can't ask a question on Shmuel, because if these are 3 handbreadth boards, then there's no problem with the Brisa saying that if you have 3 handbreadth boards, you need to join 2 of those boards together to invalidate your sukkah, because you need 4 handbreadths to invalidate your sukkah, and these boards are only 3 handbreadths each. That's the way Shmuel had learned earlier. Rav is the one who says, no, the boards that we're talking about are boards that are 4 handbreadths. If the boards are 4 handbreadths, then the Gemara has a very strong question. What are you joining boards together? What do you need this term mitzdarfen? They join together. There's no such thing as joining the boards together. According to Reb Meir, the board is a non-kosher and it's 4 handbreadths. That itself invalidates your sukkah. There's no what joining together. That term is all, it doesn't fit. It doesn't flow. However, if you learn that you have up to 4 cubits of non-kosher slach until you invalidate your sukkah. So here, that makes sense to have a word joining, that you have a non-kosher board. It's only 4 handbreadths, but you need it to be 4 cubits to invalidate your sukkah. If in order to invalidate the sukkah, it needs to be 4 cubits. So you'll join them together. If they're next to each other, they can join together to invalidate your sukkah. So the Gemara is asking a question specifically on the way Rav had learned that earlier Gemara and that earlier Mishnah. That's how this question is able to be developed here. And it would not be a question on Shmuel. And that's why the Gemara specifically asks it on Rav in the version from Surah that the Gemara had brought first. Now, the Gemara says that the answer to this question is that that we're talking about, again, this concept that it's a daifan akuma type of issue. It's on the side, and the mitzdaref to the 4 cubits, which is the rule according to everyone, that on the side of the sukkah you have up to 4 cubits of non-kosher schach. But once you reach 4 cubits, it invalidates your sukkah. So they will join together to invalidate your sukkah. These boards, if they reach up to 4 cubits. Now that only applies according to Reb Meir. The first opinion says there's no limit. You could put your whole sukkah boards, because again, we're following the view of Rav, that the way Rav learned the argument of Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda is that Reb Yehuda holds that you're allowed to have boards for schach, and there's no gzeiras tikra, there's no decree against the roof, and so therefore the first opinion says they're not mitzdaref, there's no tziruf, there's no issue here, because you could have the whole sukkah with these boards. But according to Reb Meir, each board is 4 handbreadths. Each board is puzzle, is invalid schach, and if you have 4 cubits of these boards together on the side of your sukkah, it'll invalidate it, and they will join together to reach that amount, that threshold of 4 cubits. Okay, so that was the second question, and then the Gemara had the third question. What was the third question? Again, the third question is also on this opinion of 4 handbreadths that invalidates the sukkah in the middle of the sukkah. This is what we're constantly asking. All 3 questions were basically against this view of that 4 handbreadths in the middle of the sukkah invalidates the sukkah. The third question was from this Mishnah, from a brisa that we also had learned earlier, and the brisa was a little confusing. It was a brisa about using these boards that it says they're 4 handbreadths. The boards are 4 handbreadths, and the brisa says everyone agrees that the it's puzzle, it's invalid. Now, the Gemara had used this brisa earlier to say that Shmuel, his way of understanding the argument of Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, he has a brisa that backs him. Rav also had a brisa that backed him. They both had brisas that backed them, which basically means that this argument of Rav and Shmuel does seem to be an argument of earlier original rabbis, of the rabbis of the Mishnah, seem to have argued with this in this discussion. And Rav and Shmuel were basically, both of them had brisas, and maybe they weren't aware of it, but But they both had one of the there's brises that one says pretty clearly like Rav, and the other one says clearly like Shmuel. And this is one of those brises that shows us that this is the brisa that actually the Gemara brings to show that Shmuel, that there's an opinion of the Tanoim that follows Shmuel's way of thinking, and this brisa was like support for Shmuel. Now, what is the brisa? How do you see that? Well, because the brisa says that everyone agrees when you have a board that's 4 handbreadths, it's invalid, it's psula. Now, according to the Rav's way of thinking, that's not a divrei hakoil. It's not everyone agrees with that. That would be a opinion of Reb Meir, but not the opinion of Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda would permit boards that even if they're 4 handbreadths, according to Rav. So this fits with Shmuel. Shmuel felt that any board that's 4 handbreadths, it's always going to be invalid for schach, 4 hand, because 4 handbreadths is so typical for schach, for the roof, that such a board, it's that's so typical that for sure people are going to confuse that. For sure the rabbis made a decree, and you can't use such boards for schach. Now, so that's the brisa, but the brisa continues and talks about what if it's less than 4 handbreadths. So less than 4 handbreadths, that's where Shmuel understands that there's an argument, Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, and the brisa brings both opinions here. This is at the end of 17b, where it brings both of those opinions on the bottom line. Reb Meir, Paisel, Reb Yehuda, Machshir. That we have these 2 opinions, and that this is the way Shmuel understood it, that if it's less than 4, it's 3, more than 3 or more than 3 handbreadths, then we're going to have an argument, Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, if these boards are kosher. If there were 4, everyone agrees they're invalid. If they're 3, then if they're 3 or more than 3, then there's an argument, Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda. Okay, because the Gemara explained why 3 you could argue with 3. 4 is more of a makam chashuv, and 3 was it doesn't fall under the category of lavud. The Gemara earlier had mentioned these reasonings why each rabbi held his way, Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda. So that's the way the brisa category it summarizes, or it mentions this argument with Meir, Reb Yehuda. But the brisa continues and says, "Umayde Reb Meir," that Reb Meir will agree, and this is on page 18a, that if there's a space between each of the boards, the size of one of the boards, then you could just put kosher schach there and the whole thing will be kosher. Now, the question, of course, is what is that case really talking about? And the Gemara wants to use this as a question on the opinion that 4 handbreadths will invalidate a sukkah. The Gemara is going to try to use this as a proof that it can't be that 4 handbreadths will invalidate the sukkah, because if 4 handbreadths will invalidate the sukkah, how could Reb Meir agree and say this is kosher if you have a boards and you have kosher schach in the middle? Now, the question is, maybe Reb Meir is not talking about 4 handbreadth boards. Maybe he's talking about less than 4 handbreadth boards. In fact, if it is 4 handbreadth boards, the Gemara could have also said, Moide Reb Yehuda, that even Reb Yehuda agrees, because 4 handbreadth boards, Reb Yehuda also claims that it's puzzle. And here he could agree that 4 handbreadth boards are actually, in this scenario, it's going to be kosher, even though normally 4 handbreadth boards, because according to the way Shmuel learns, and that's this brisa, that even everyone agrees 4 handbreadth boards are invalid. And here you're going to somehow come up with some way to be in between every other board. You put the space, you have kosher schach there, and somehow it's kosher. So the Gemara, maybe it doesn't mean that it's 4 handbreadths. Maybe it's only 3 handbreadths. Now, if it's 3 handbreadths, let's think about that. You have 3 handbreadths. Moide Reb Meir agrees. I normally hold, Reb Meir says that 3 handbreadths is invalid schach. It's invalid schach, 3 handbreadths. Can't use these boards. But if you put in between each of them the kosher schach, it'll be kosher. Now, would that fit? Would that make sense?
Because it doesn't look like a roof.
Well, the problem is that these boards are non-kosher schach. Whether, the fact is these are non-kosher schach. Like even if you put them standing on the width side, they're non-kosher schach. So if they're non-kosher schach and you have some kosher schach in the middle of each of them, will that be a kosher sukkah? And why is he going to allow it? So,
but it seems to be sure that it's only three handbreadths.
Yeah, 3 or 3.5. Yeah. Let's say that's the case. In other words, the Gemara, in order to learn the Gemara properly, for the Gemara's question to make sense, you need to say that Rav Meir is talking about 4 handbreadths. But I'm questioning this, and it's not my own question. The commentaries talk about this. Seemingly, you could learn this with 3, and then the Gemara's question would not be such a strong question. It would not even be a question, because if we learn that it's talking about it, there 3 that the boards are only 3 handbreadths, so then there's no reason why it should be invalid. Actually, what do I mean? Let's say it's talking about they're 3 handbreadth boards. Now, Rav Meir holds that these are non-kosher schach. True, they're non-kosher schach. But are they 4 handbreadths?
No.
In order for non-kosher schach to invalidate a sukkah, it needs to be 4 handbreadths. These are only 3 handbreadths.
Right, so but the issue is if you put them next to one another, are they misafin?
So the case is that yesh bein neser leneser, that you have a space in between each of them, so they're not next to each other. There's a space in between each of them with psal, with kosher schach. So would this sukkah be kosher sukkah if you have non-kosher schach, but it's not 4 handbreadths, but it's a lot of non-kosher schach there? Every other one is non-kosher, but you don't have but you have equal amount of kosher and non-kosher schach, and the thing is that would actually be kosher. That would be a valid sukkah.
And we arranged it that the 2 that in the middle, though.
No, even without that.
Okay, all right.
Even without that, let's say you don't have the 2 next to each other.
Okay.
Because we're going to be able to consider this schach to be a kosher sukkah to the extent. Now keep this in mind, that your sukkah is not invalidated, and you should be allowed to even sleep under the non-kosher schach.
Right.
Because non-kosher schach, we said in Shulchan Aruch that according to the Shulchan Aruch, that we saw on the bottom, that there's another opinion that if it's more than 3, maybe you shouldn't sleep under it. But the Shulchan Aruch itself paskins this way, Rashi holds, you're allowed to sleep under non-kosher schach. If it's less than 4 handbreadths, you could sleep under it. So, and this is in the middle of the sukkah. The sukkah has more than, it has a kosher schach more than 7 handbreadths. It's not exactly together, but that's okay. You have non-kosher schach, but the non-kosher schach doesn't invalidate the sukkah at any point of your sukkah. It's not invalidated.
Right.
So therefore, your sukkah is going to be a kosher. So this could be a way of learning this brisa. That Umayda Rav Meir agrees that if there's between each board, you have the same amount, these boards are less than 4 handbreadths, that it's kosher. And then you would not have any question. Now, if they were 4 handbreadths, then it would invalidate your sukkah, maybe.
Right, and you couldn't sleep under it.
The 3 handbreadth boards, they're non-kosher schach, but it's not the threshold that ruins the sukkah of that amount of non-kosher schach. So you have non-kosher schach, but the non-kosher schach didn't reach that threshold. So that would be a way of learning the Gemara. And the Ritva actually says that the Gemara could have answered this question with saying that. But the Gemara wants to say that in the way Rashi, if you look on the top Rashi says, V'ashe yesh bahen daled namikum. It's also talking about a case where it's 4. These boards, the Meir doesn't clarify what boards. He's saying all boards. It's 4, it's 3. If you put the board kosher schach in the middle, it's going to be kosher. So now, if you learn that it's talking about 4 handbreadths, that's how you're able to ask the question that the Gemara is now going to ask. What's the question that the Gemara is now going to ask? Again, we're on 18a on the top, and I'm just going over this because it's just to give you clarity on these clarity on these complicated things where it's very similar laws and yet they're different similar cases and different laws and different opinions. So Reb Meir, the Gemara says, Reb Meir agrees, and we're going to learn that it's talking about that it's 4 handbreadth boards because we're talking about all boards. So even if they're 4 handbreadths, and of course that's the case, that's going to be the problem, is when they're 4 handbreadth boards. That is a case where when they're 4 handbreadth boards, and what do? So Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda hold this is a non-kosher sukkah. If you have all boards of 4 handbreadths, according to Shmuel, this is the brisa that follows Shmuel's view. Everyone agrees that this is non-kosher if it only has these boards, 4 handbreadth boards. But even Reb Meir will agree that if you take every other board out, you can actually kosher your sukkah. Kosher your sukkah. I've got 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach. Every other, all along my whole sukkah, there's every other area has this board that's non-kosher. And how could this sukkah be kosher? And the Gemara says this fits good if you hold that you could have non-kosher schach that's up to 4 cubits. Okay, then it would actually work. If you have up to 4 cubits, that's fine. But if you have only 4 handbreadths, this for sure invalidates your sukkah. You know what would happen if you have, according to that view, you have every other area is non-kosher schach. It separates your sukkah. You actually have to cut your sukkah into 6 pieces over here. Each piece is like it's dividing your sukkah. You got this sukkah, then you have non-kosher schach, so that divides it to the next sukkah, the next sukkah, the next sukkah. Your one sukkah that you thought was going to be a kosher sukkah is now seemingly it's now totally non-kosher. You got so much non-kosher schach there, and it reaches the threshold for handbreadths. And if that's the threshold, then it shouldn't be kosher. How could Reb Meir agree to this? And that was the Gemara's question. What's the Gemara's answer? The Gemara says that Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yeshua, says we're talking about a sukkah that's exactly 8 cubits, and you have Neser, Pesel, and then Neser, Pesel. And this is the case that we said that we came up with, where it's not just every other thing is kosher, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, kosher. No. The middle actually joins together the 2 koshers at the same point, and the sides that are beyond that are actually doifen akuma. They're all, it's all walls. But the middle, actually, you're doing this every other, but you have to start on one side and start on the other in order to have in the middle that they actually meet, 2 koshers meet together. Does everyone understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That you have kosher schachs. Each area is 4 handbreadths, 4 handbreadths of non-kosher board, 4 handbreadths kosher schach, 4 handbreadths.
So you mean you have to end up on the other side? You can't start from one
You can't
side.
start on one side and go
by the
all
time
across.
you get to the other side, you're
Right.
putting that kosher schach instead of the non-kosher schach. In other words, you got to have the non-kosher on the ends, right? Is that what you're saying?
And you got to start twice. You got to start on one side and then go to the middle, and then start on the other side and go to the middle. In this way, when you meet, you could have actually 2 kosher schachs kissing each other.
Right.
Then this sukkah will work. And that's what Reb Meir meant. He didn't say it clearly. Reb Meir only said you have to take every other one out and you put kosher schach there. But the Gemara says, you know what he must have meant, according to the opinion, that you only get 4 handbreadths of up to 4 handbreadths of non-kosher schach. Once you reach 4 handbreadths, it's already invalidates your sukkah. The only way to learn, to understand Reb Meir, he must have meant that you have to start doing this every other one on both sides. You can't just go on one side and go all the way across, because then you'll never have 2 kosher schachs kissing each other to ultimately reach the size that you need, which is 7 handbreadths. In this case, it actually reaches 8 handbreadths because you're doing these 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. So that's what the Gemara explains. That's what Reb Meir meant, and that is the meaning of his saying. Now what comes out from here really is that you're relying on doif and akuma for the sides, and the middle area of this sukkah is going to be a kosher sukkah. You're relying on dofen akuma, like the sides are walls. The sides, so you have kosher, non-kosher, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, kosher, non-kosher, kosher, and although that area on the sides is all, is all it's all a wall. Now, I mentioned yesterday that, so what do you need all that for? Why do you need to take one out, every other one out, keep all the non-kosher schach there, and just take two middle ones out and put kosher schach in the middle? Right? We're talking about how many boards were there originally? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then 6. You had, right. You have 6. You had 12. You had you had 12 boards that were originally there, each 4 tfachim, 4 handbreadths. So 12 boards times 4 is 48. Right? That's what you had originally. You removed every other one. In the middle, you ended up with 2 right next to each other. And now you have kosher schach all in those. Half of that area is kosher schach. It's fine, right? And you have dofen akuma. Well, dofen akuma, I don't need to remove every other one. Dofen akuma, leave the boards, let it be non-kosher. So it seems that well, I mentioned yesterday that there is such a view that says, you know what? When you have these non-kosher, kosher, even though you're calling this dofen akuma, you're allowed to sit under the kosher schach. Now, I told you the Meiri brings this down, and then he questions it. How could you have that? But if that's true, that you could sit under the kosher schach, that's why that would be a reason that would answer this question, if that's true. Now, it could be that even Rashi agrees with that. There is a Rashi here that has a very strange term where he says that under the schach you could sit, that you can't sit under the boards. Why does he say under the boards? It sounds like he's saying that under the boards you can't sit. Tachas hanesarim lo yisha. You can't sit under the boards. So maybe he means that maybe you could sit under the schach part. But remember, it's called a wall. It's called a wall. It's called dofen akuma. So it seems very surprising that would be the meaning of Rashi. I personally think that Rashi just meant under the board area, you can't sleep. That's my understanding. Under that whole board area, you can't sleep. Rashi doesn't say that. So if you want to be medayik in the words, I don't know, to say Rashi holds this, it's very surprising. Even the Meiri question, he brings one source that says it, but he questions it. So seemingly, the reason why it says you do this every other one is because, I think the reason is because when it comes to a board that's less than 4, if it's a three hand breadth board, then you need to do every other one. When you're dealing with 3 hand breadth board, you could sit even under the boards when it's a 3 hand breadth sukkah. And that's why it says you take every other one out. And this way you'll be allowed to sit. You don't need to rely on dofen akuma. You could sit in the whole sukkah. If it's a 3 hand breadth board, then you take every other one out. That's why it says in Yesh Bein Neser, the Neser Kamale Neser, that for that case you need to do every other one. For this case, you can get away without it. If you did every other one, it also works. But you don't have to do it that way. He's just putting both cases in the same category. Yes, Ezra.
So if we're doing a dofen akuma, the bent part is a maximum of 4 amot, correct?
The bent part, correct.
Okay, so so what that means, you can't sit under that because that part is not kosher.
It's a wall, right? That's
Okay.
what the common view. That's the common.
And in the middle, you have kosher schach.
8 hand breadths.
So you would have to have your table basically go across the kosher schach, so that people can sit on either side of the table under the schach. That's what.
Now, well, the only thing I would correct in what you said, which is what you said is correct, except that you're talking in a plural way. Now, when we talk about a small sukkah, which is 7 by 7 hand breadths, that sukkah really is a one-person sukkah. It's
Right, but you're talking about
Reishai
48,
Rubai Shulchanai.
you're talking about 48 handbreadths over here. We're not talking about 7 by 7. So I'm
Well, not
talking about
exactly.
2 people.
The only thing is I have to correct that. I have to say I don't know if I can agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Your sukkah is very big here, but the kosher part of your sukkah is not that big. The kosher part of your sukkah is only 8 handbreadths. It's 1 handbreadth more. It's 4 inches more than the minimum sukkah.
No,
Because
I understand that. Rabbi, I understand that.
okay,
What I'm saying is that if you put your table across, even if part of the table is under the board, the Dofen Akuma portion, whatever, you can still sit 2 people on either side.
okay. But the thing is, keep in mind that we hold that this table should be in the sukkah. We don't allow the table to be under a
No,
non-kosher.
you're gonna have a portion of the table which is 8 by 8, and it's fine.
As long as at least a tefach is in the kosher part.
Yeah, you're gonna have 8.
According to
You're
other
gonna have 8.
opinions.
You're gonna have a portion of your table which is 8 tefachim long,
Mhm.
however wide your table
Okay.
is.
Uh-huh.
That's going to be the kosher part of the table. And as long as you sit on either side of that kosher part, you're fine.
Right. Right. You're saying the sukkah's long. Sukkah has throughout that length of the 8 hand breadths you have. Correct. You have a good point. Yeah.
So
So it's
you
possible to
have,
fit more than
so you have a you have Dufen Akuma this way and that way, with the intervening area being your kosher schach. And then
Right.
you have your tables lying across this way, and the
Mhm.
2 people sitting on either side like that.
Right.
You're
Right.
under the
Seemingly
kosher
you're right.
schach.
Yeah. Yep. And
Okay.
then if it's very long, the sukkah, you could have that twice. You could have 2 people with their table here, 2 people with the table here. You could continue doing that depending on how big the sukkah is, because we know one side of it is 8 hand breadths. We don't know how far it goes. So yeah, you could have such a thing. It's possible. My point was that don't get distracted by the fact that this is a 48, this is an 8 cubit sukkah. Sounds like a big sukkah, but it's not exactly so big. It's only eight hand breadths, at least in the width. But you're right. You have the length, and you can sit there. You can tup it. Yeah.
Now I'm
Yeah, you're
I'm going by what's written in the Gemara. The fact that you have a Nesser, and then you have Pesel, Nesser, Pesel, etc.
right.
on both sides. So
Yeah.
that, based on your count, that's a 48 tefach wide sukkah, of which only 8.
But again, where
Okay,
you're
it's
sitting
good.
and where your table is and where you're sitting, how big is that?
Well, if your table is long, as I said before, you're going to have 8 tefachim of your table that are under the kosher sukkah, times whatever the width of the table is. So as long as you have, according to you, if you have 1 tefach or more, you have a table that's 8 by 1 or more tefachim, so that's a kosher table.
Right.
On which you have 2 people sitting across from each other.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's fine. All I wanted to find out is when you said Dofen Akuma, whether that's the 4 amot part of the roof, or of the schach, of the area of the non-kosher schach that is being now added to the rest of the wall to form the Dofen Akuma. That's what I wanted to find out. Okay.
That part of this sukkah is called Daifan Akuma, not kosher. Is that what you mean? What?
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, nobody would be sitting under there, because
no one should sit under there. That's the common understanding. I did mention that there is a view that says you might be allowed to sit under the schach part, and could even possibly kvetch such a insight into Rashi, which it definitely seem very surprising. And the common understanding is, as you said, that you cannot sit under the Daifan Akuma part. All you have is 8 hand breadths along the entire area of the sukkah. That one area that's 8 hand breadths width, which goes as far as the sukkah goes backwards, that would be your how far you have in that sukkah. And we know that one person could sit 7 by 7. So if this is 8 hand breadths, you have 1 extra hand breadth, and it goes as far back. So it's not it's not necessarily 8 by 7. It could be 8 by 100. So you could probably fit a lot of people, but you just remember you only have that middle area to sit in, and you have which is only 8 hand breadths wide. It's long, but it's only 8 hand breadths wide. Yeah. So that what you said is, if I understood you correctly, Ezra, yes, everything you said was correct.
Okay,
Okay. So
but that's not the way I build it, so that's okay.
right. Okay, so that I think gives us a little more clarity on this Gemara about how to answer the question. So the way the question is, the way we answer the question, that if it's 4 hand breadths of non-kosher schach, it should invalidate the sukkah in the middle. But here in the middle of your sukkah, you don't have 4 hand breadths of non-kosher schach. You have this on the side. On the side, it doesn't invalidate it. In the middle, it would have. But in this sukkah, we came out with we figured out how you did it in a way that there isn't 4 hand breadths of non-kosher schach. But if there was 4 hand breadths of non-kosher schach, there is such an opinion that says that it would be invalid and it could fit with this brisa. Okay, so that was the conclusion of that Gemara. And now we're up to a new piece of Gemara here. And we're up to Amar Abaye. So we're on page 18a. Amar Abaye. It's about maybe 12 lines from the top. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, 18a, everyone. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Avir Shloisha, when you have empty space that is 3 hand breadths.
Sukkah Gedola.
The Sukkah Gedola, on a big Sukkah. Umiatai. And what are you going to do? You minimized it. Bain bekanim, bain bishpudin. Whether with kanim, with reeds, which is kosher schach, or whether with skewers, which are non-kosher schach. And however you did it, you minimized the empty space. Havi miyut, that is considered a miyut. It is considered a kosher way of minimizing your big problem. Again, the problem was that you had empty space, and how much empty space will invalidate your sukkah if it reaches 3 hand breadths. That's the threshold. At that point, it'll invalidate your sukkah. 3 hand breadths. And when the way to get around that problem is by putting kosher schach in that empty space, or non-kosher schach. You could even put non-kosher schach there, and like skewers, and fill up the empty space, and it'll validate your sukkah. Now, the Gemara says, what about a small sukkah? No, but before we do the small sukkah, why is that? How could you put some non-kosher schach and it'll work? Well, because number one, non-kosher schach and empty space doesn't join together, that which we learned earlier. And the fact is that even non-kosher schach has much more than 3 hand breadths before your sukkah is invalidated. You get even it has more than 3 hand breadths before your sukkah is invalidated. You have either 4 hand breadths or maybe 4 cubits. Again, there are 2 opinions. But empty space, we said 3 hand breadths is the maximum, and the reason that why 3 hand breadths is the maximum of empty space seems to have to do with the fact that it's much more visible than if you had non-kosher schach. Like non-kosher schach is less visible. The empty space is much more visible, and at three, even at 3, it's clear that you're missing, that some areas missing schach, and that will invalidate your sukkah. And so empty space invalidates the sukkah if it's 3 hand breadths wide. Now, less than 3 handbreadths would be lavud, would have the law of lavud. You would have the law of lavud, which would attach it. Now, we did learn that even if it's less than 3, and I think Ezra brought this up, that even so, if it's less than 3 hands, if it's empty space, you really shouldn't sit under it. Non-kosher schach, you could sit on, but empty space seemed to be more strict. But anyway, we'll see a little more about that. So our Gemara talks about the Sukkah Gedolah first. Abaye mentions about Sukkah Gedolah, big Sukkah. So here you're not dealing with having the proper measurement of a Sukkah. You have a kosher Sukkah, but you have an area that might cut it in half, that might ruin your Sukkah. And therefore, if you fill it up with kosher schach or non-kosher schach, this empty space, it'll actually work and kosher your Sukkah. The Sukkah Katana, what happens if it's a small Sukkah? Basically, it has 7 by 7 handbreadths, and there's empty space of 3 handbreadths. So what do you need to do to kosher this Sukkah? So b'kanim havimiyot, if you use kanim reeds, kosher schach, that's good. That will minimize that empty space, and the Sukkah will be kosher. And b'shpudin, if you use non-kosher schach, shpudin, skewers, lo havimiyot, it is not going to minimize the empty space, and it will cause that the Sukkah will not have its measurement here. So it was similar to the earlier Gemara that we had, where in a certain sense you could say, well, what do you mean? Don't I get non-kosher schach? You get 4 handbreadths, and empty space 3. So here I'm putting non-kosher schach, at least I should have 4 handbreadths. But the thing is, because it's a small sukkah, you don't have the proper measurement of a sukkah to make it kosher. Here you have a problem not about invalidating the sukkah, but you just simply don't have enough for a kosher sukkah. And there's 3 handbreadths that are not kosher, and this is considered a significant amount of space, and it can't be koshered. You can't you can't fix it with these shpudin, with these non-kosher schach. But Rashi asked this question. He says, "What do you mean? I have skewers here, and that it doesn't reach the threshold of non-kosher." But Rashi says, since there's 3 handbreadths together, kosher of skewers, of empty space, it removes that they're considered significant, and they don't join with to make it the measurement of the sukkah to be 7 handbreadths. So basically, the problem here is that it's too small of a sukkah, and you're trying to if you want to use non-kosher schach on a regular sukkah, okay, but here you also don't even have the right size. You don't even have the size of a sukkah yet. So you're already jumping to your non-kosher schach. That's you're already you're trying to that's going too far. Now the Gemara says, "V'hani mili menatzat." Now this applies about when you have this empty space. When that empty space, if it's less than 3 handbreadths, it'll allow you to still have a kosher sukkah. That if it's less than 3 handbreadths, the sukkah will still be kosher. That works min hatzad if it's by the side of the sukkah, because we're going to say the law of lavud, and that's what I mentioned earlier, that if it's less than 3 handbreadths of empty space, you have this law called lavud that it attaches the two, and we consider it that it closes off this empty space, and it'll be a kosher sukkah. Again, if it's on the side, you're missing a few few hand breaths, up to 3 hand breaths, so that it'll still be kosher. But abel be'emtza, but in the middle of the roof of the schach of the sukkah, then what happens if you have empty space less than 3? Pligi ba Ravacha v'Ravina. There's an argument, Ravacha and Ravina. Chad amar yesh lavud be'emtza. One of them says you still can rely on this law called lavud in the middle of the sukkah. V'chad amar, one of them says, ein lavud be'emtza. You can't rely on lavud in the middle of the sukkah, and the empty space in the middle of the sukkah will divide your sukkah, and each part of your sukkah will only have 2 walls, and there's no lavud in the middle of the sukkah. And what does this mean? So Tosfos over here mentions that we're not talking about on the walls of the sukkah, in the middle of the wall. Could you rely on lavud? Yeah, in the middle of the wall, you could rely on lavud. We're talking about that in the schach part. That's where you can't, according to one opinion, you cannot rely on lavud to join. If you have an empty space that goes all along your whole sukkah from one side to the other, that would be a problem, even less than 3 hand breaths, because we don't say lavud on the schach. We do say lavud, but not regarding the schach. So if it's at the side of your sukkah, then it'll work because it's the wall. The wall can be connected to your schach, but the side on the middle of your schach, we're not going to say lavud. So the Gemara says, "My taima demandi omar yesh lavud ben." So what's the reason of this opinion that says that you have lavud in the middle of the schach? The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa regarding the laws of the mavui. The mavui is this alleyway where it's closed off on three sides with courtyards, and you're not allowed to carry in it until you put on the 4th side some type of either machitza or a hecker. Machitza means some type of a wall type of item, or a hecker, a recognizable item to show that this is different than a reshus harabim, than a public area. What do you need to put? Either a pole, a beam, stand vertical, or a horizontal beam across. So what is it? So otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to carry them. Now the Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, koira hayoytzeitz mikoisel zeh, a beam that goes out from this wall, ve'ena nagas koisel acher, it doesn't reach the other side. What happens then? So it only reaches, let's say, it's missing a little at the end. Don't ask me how it's standing there. I guess you have a good support somehow. But it's a beam across. Imagine you have this beam, but it's too small. And of course, in the olden days, you got to understand, it wasn't like today. You just buy a Home Depot, you go buy a 16-footer instead of a 10-footer, But there, you in the olden days, it's probably very hard to schlep. They didn't have trucks and cars. And so anyway, so what do? So it doesn't reach the other side. V'chein, another example. Shtei koires. If you have 2, one on one side of this 4th entrance of the entrance, the open side of this mavui, of this alley. So you have one coming from one end, one coming from the other. You have one coming from one end, one coming from the other end. And they are not, they're not touching one another. So what do you do then? If there's, again, we're not talking about that there's a huge gap, but there's a lavud gap, a gap that maybe you rely on love. If you have less than 3, you don't have to bring another beam, because lavud allows you to consider it that they're attached. What about shloisha? If it is 3, if it's already 3 handbreadths or more, you have to go get another beam. And so you see that this applies to these beams, even in the middle, not just on the side, even in the case of 2, which is basically a hole in the middle of the beam. And we're going to allow it to be considered as a din lavud. Now, the Gemara says, v'idach, in the other opinion, how is he going to explain this brisa that talks about a case of lavud in the middle? So the Gemara says, Shani kairais d'Rabbanan. That you're right. Normally you can't do lavud in the middle. But yeah, come on, this is a rabbinic law. This is not a biblical law. You need some big beam over there. This is a rabbinic law. It's like a hecker. It's some type of a recognition that it's not a public domain. So it's a d'Rabbanan. And Minatayra, you don't need to fix this mavoi. It's kosher, but it's rabbinical. It's a rabbinic law, and therefore you can use this. The law of lavud is good enough. Now sukkah is different. Sukkah is it's a biblical law, and either we have the teaching of lavud or we don't have the rule of lavud. And so here you don't necessarily say it. So then the Gemara says, "My time of demand amar ain't lavud bab." So what's the reason of the opinion that you don't say lavud in the middle of the roof of schach? Now I mentioned earlier again on the walls we're not going to talk. This is not an issue. In the walls you could use lavud. People rely on lavud all the time, but in the schach. Here, what would the reason be that you don't rely on lavud in the middle of the schach? Because we have a Mishnah in Oyalos. And the Mishnah says you have an aruba, which is basically like a window or a hole, shebe bias, that's in the house. And uva paisech tefach. It has the size is a handbreadth by a handbreadth. So you have this hole. Now, nothing else is covering it, so it's basically there's no oil over there. So the law is tuma babayis. If there's impurity in the house, so in other words, not under the window, not under. We'll call this what do you call those windows in the roof? A sky. What do they call them?
Skylight.
Skylights. Okay, thank you. So the skylight, this skylight that we're talking about, doesn't have a glass. It's empty. It's open to the sky. So this skylight, now the tuma, the impurity, is not under the skylight. It's under the house. Tuma babayis. It's under the other parts of the ceiling. Kulai tame. The whole house is, and everything in it, all the vessels in the house are going to be impure. But masha keneged aruba is tahar. Any of the vessels that are under that skylight, those would be pure because they're not under the same tent as the impurity. Now, how big was this tent? How big was this skylight? 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth. It says it has an opening of a handbreadth. So that's all it is. So the tuma, the tuma will not be metame. Now, what about lavud? It's only 1 handbreadth width. Why isn't the tuma? Why is the impurity causing everything, even the stuff under the even the stuff under the skylight should be tame? They have the law of lavud. Now, tuma keneged aruba. If there's impurity opposite the window, kol habayis kulei tar. The whole house is tar because there's no tent over the impurity to go and make impure all the vessels. Now, ein ba'aruba paisech tefach. If it's less than a handbreadth, Tuma babayis, if there's impurity in the house, so it says keneged aruba tuma babayis, if there's impurity in the house, not near the skylight. So keneged aruba is tahar. So near the what's under the skylight is pure. Tuma keneged aruba, but if let's say there's impurity under the skylight, so kol habayis kulay tahar, the whole house is pure, because there's no oyhel, there's no tent on the impurity. Now the bottom line is that we saw earlier that when it was when there's a tefach space, the point is that we saw that even though you could have said loved, we didn't say loved. That's really what the Gemara's proof was. That you could have said loved. We don't. Why? Because it's the middle of the roof. Now the Gemara answers that the Gemara says, so what's the other opinion going to do? V'idach, what would the other opinion do? You see here, you don't say loved. So the answer is Shani Hilchas Tumah Dahachay Gamir. The laws of Tumah, of impurity, are halacha l'maisha Sinai. They have their own rules that you don't say loved in the middle. That doesn't mean that it applies to Sukkah. So these are the two opinions that we have. Okay, we'll have to continue more a little about this Hashem tomorrow. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
I'm gonna be traveling tomorrow, Mr. Hashem. So I'm hoping to have someone take over for me. Mr.
Rabbi
Hashem.
Wernick.
Well, he teaches. That's the problem.
That's right. That was summertime.
I'm going to Rabbi Wernick for his son's bar mitzvah. That's why I'm going to be traveling with the
Mazel tov.
Okay.